The final months of the Second World War left behind a Europe scarred by destruction and uncertainty. Millions of men and women were uprooted from their homes, carried across borders, and placed into camps as prisoners of war. Among them were German women who had served in auxiliary roles, suddenly transported thousands of miles away from the ruins of their homeland. Imagine the disorientation of arriving in a foreign country, where every sound, every sign, and every face belonged to the former enemy. Behind tall fences and guarded watchtowers, these women entered a world that was both quiet and suffocating, a strange afterlife to the chaos they had just left behind. Inside the American camps, daily life moved according to rigid schedules. Roll calls, meals, and work assignments defined the passing hours, leaving little space for individuality. For the women, the silence between these routines often spoke louder than the activities themselves. The sense of isolation was heavy, magnified by the absence of familiar voices and the knowledge that their fate was in the hands of those who had once fought to defeat them. The monotony of captivity pressed down like a second prison, where the lack of choice became as oppressive as the barbed wire. For the American soldiers assigned to guard these prisoners, the situation was no less complex. They were young, often only a few years older than the women in the camps, and they were tasked with enforcing strict separation. Yet, beneath the surface of authority, many shared the same restless energy and unease that comes with being far from home. They too had left behind families, sweethearts, and unfinished lives. Standing watch over the camp, they found themselves staring at the very people who had once been described as enemies, but who now seemed more like distant reflections of their own condition. The camp environment became a paradox. It was a place designed to suppress individuality, yet it inadvertently magnified human presence. The sound of footsteps crunching gravel during roll call, the murmur of conversations in a foreign tongue, or the faint echo of laughter in the barracks at night, all served as reminders that behind the label of prisoner were living, breathing people. For the guards, it was impossible to ignore this reality for long. Despite the weight of war and the official rules, a quiet awareness grew, suggesting that the boundaries between captor and captive might not be as absolute as they seemed. It was within this uneasy atmosphere that something unusual began to take shape. What started as fleeting glances or unspoken gestures slowly turned into secret exchanges. A folded piece of paper, carried discreetly from one side of the fence to the other, broke the silence in a way that nothing else could. These were not orders, not reports, but poems written in careful handwriting by American soldiers. In a world defined by discipline and division, poetry became an act of defiance and humanity, slipping through the cracks of a system built to keep people apart. The presence of these poems transformed the camp in subtle but profound ways. For the women, they represented a rare acknowledgement, a reminder that someone saw them as more than prisoners of war. For the soldiers, they offered an escape from their own roles, giving voice to emotions that could not otherwise be spoken. Within the monotony of captivity, poetry became a bridge across silence, a fragile yet powerful connection. In the shadow of global conflict, it was this unlikely exchange that would carve out a small but unforgettable story of human resilience. The idea of poetry passing between guards and prisoners was nothing short of extraordinary. War was supposed to separate people with hard, unbreakable lines. In the barracks and on the parade grounds, discipline ruled every movement. Orders were barked, routines were drilled, and the space between the watchtower and the wire was meant to be a void of silence. Yet in these American camps, that void began to fill with words that had no place in the official language of war. The contrast was striking, for instead of hostility, scraps of paper carried fragments of tenderness and longing. To those who witnessed it, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. Imagine a German woman in captivity sitting on a wooden bunk, unfolding a slip of paper written in careful English. Outside her window, armed guards patrolled the fences, but inside her hands rested words that spoke not of commands, but of dreams. It was a world divided into two layers, one visible and harsh, the other hidden and fragile. Officially, she was the enemy, but the poem reminded her of something deeper, something human. The clash between these two realities created an emotional tension that neither side could easily reconcile. For the American soldiers, the act carried its own conflict. Their duty was to guard, not to connect, and every step toward personal exchange threatened that duty. They had been trained to see the prisoners as remnants of a defeated enemy, people who once stood against their homeland. Yet, when confronted with the presence of young women who laughed, worried, and grieved like anyone else, the rigid categories of war began to blur. Passing a poem was at once a betrayal of regulation and a fulfillment of a deeper need for expression. The soldiers lived in this contradiction, caught between obedience and the quiet rebellion of empathy. The German women experienced the poems with equal complexity. Some read them in silence, treasuring the words as small comforts in a place designed to erase dignity. Others may have feared what such gestures implied, questioning whether they were safe to even hold on to the scraps of paper. Each verse carried with it not only meaning but also risk. Discovery could bring punishment, shame, or suspicion from both sides. To accept the poem was to carry a secret weight, balancing gratitude against danger. This was the true conflict of the camps. The official world demanded separation, but the private world reached for connection. The presence of poetry turned ordinary interactions into acts filled with tension and risk. A folded piece of paper became a battlefield of its own, where fear and hope collided. The lines of verse revealed the contradiction at the heart of captivity, showing that war could enforce distance, but could not completely extinguish the human impulse to reach across it. In this way, the poems stood as both comfort and reminder. They comforted by offering moments of recognition and compassion, yet they reminded all involved of the unnatural divide that war had created. The German women, holding onto their fragile verses, felt both seen and trapped. The American soldiers, writing them in quiet corners, felt both liberated and bound. It was this tension, this constant clash of emotion and circumstance, that gave the poems their enduring power. They were small, hidden, and forbidden, but in their very existence they spoke louder than any order shouted across the camp. The story of these poems did not begin with orders from above or any official directive. It began instead with the impulses of young men who were asked to play roles much larger than their years. Many of the American soldiers assigned to guard the camps were in their late teens or early 20s. They carried rifles and wore uniforms, yet inside they were still restless sons, brothers, and would-be poets, struggling with the weight of a war they had not chosen. For them, writing was a way to reclaim something personal, to shape feelings that military life had stripped away. A scrap of paper, a pencil borrowed in a moment of quiet, became the tools of rebellion against silence. The origins of the practice were simple, yet profound. A soldier might write a short verse at night, perhaps a memory of home or a reflection on the stillness of the camp. Another might compose lines that were less about romance and more about recognition, about seeing the humanity in the prisoners who stood across the barbed wire. These poems were folded carefully, hidden in pockets, and passed discreetly during moments when eyes were turned away. Each transfer was an act of courage, for discovery could have meant severe consequences. Yet the risk seemed worth it, for the soldiers were not merely breaking rules, they were breaking isolation. For the German women, the arrival of such words was as unexpected as it was complicated. They had been trained, throughout the war years, to see Americans as the enemy. Yet here, within the confines of a guarded camp, they were handed verses that carried none of the rhetoric of violence. Instead, the poems offered fragments of longing, fragments of life beyond the fences, fragments that felt startlingly human. Imagine the sensation of reading a poem in a language that was foreign but still comprehensible, recognizing the rhythm of emotion even when the words themselves felt distant. In that recognition, something shifted, however small. In the relationship between captor and captive, the practice spread quietly, whispered among the barracks, never open enough to become widespread, but never rare enough to vanish entirely. It was not romance in the traditional sense, though some might have read it that way. More often it was a way to acknowledge presence, to counteract the invisibility that captivity imposed. For women stripped of autonomy, the poem said, "I see you." For men stripped of softness by war, the act of writing said, "I still feel." Both sides clung to these truths, because they offered what the war had nearly taken from them, the sense that they were still individuals capable of thought, feeling, and connection. In many ways, the poems can be traced back to a timeless human need for expression under constraint. Soldiers throughout history have written letters, carved initials, or sketched in margins during their long waits. Captivity amplified that impulse. In a place where silence was heavy and roles were rigid, the desire to speak through verse became even stronger. The German women, far from home and stripped of familiar comforts, became both audience and participant in this exchange. Together, these groups, separated by barbed wire, created a dialogue that existed nowhere in the official records of war. Thus, the origins of the poems were not strategic but deeply personal. They were not planned but inevitable, born from the collision of youth, distance, and the human refusal to be silenced. What began as a single act of writing grew into a small current running beneath the surface of camp life. It was fragile, always at risk of being discovered, yet strong enough to endure. In the end, these origins remind us that history is not only built by commands and treaties, but also by the quiet decisions of individuals who choose to reach across divides, even when every rule tells them not to. The poems never reached the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific, yet their impact was felt in a different kind of struggle. In the camps, where silence and routine threatened to erase individuality, the simple act of sharing words reshaped the emotional landscape. For American soldiers who had spent months or years training to fight, the poems became reminders that they were still more than instruments of war. They were still writers, dreamers, and human beings who could feel something beyond the call of duty. For the German women who had been stripped of freedom and dignity, these poems represented recognition, proof that they were seen not only as prisoners, but as people. Imagine the contrast of this hidden exchange against the backdrop of war's destruction. Outside the camp, the world was still haunted by headlines of bombings, ruined cities, and mass displacement. Inside the fences, a different battle unfolded, one fought quietly against despair. The battlefield was not marked by mud or blood, but by silence and distance. The poems acted as a bridge, carrying emotion across boundaries that were otherwise absolute. They were reminders that even in the wake of devastation, there remained a stubborn spark of connection that refused to die out. For some soldiers, writing poems was a survival mechanism. It was their way of keeping a part of themselves intact in a world that demanded conformity. Rather than suppressing their emotions, they poured them onto paper, folding them into fragile offerings that slipped between the watchful eyes of authority. In this act, they reclaimed control over a part of their lives. War had dictated their actions, but poetry allowed them to speak freely, even if only in secret. The battlefield of identity and humanity was as real as any clash of weapons, and the soldiers fought it with pens instead of rifles. For the women, receiving the poems meant something equally powerful. Each verse carried the possibility of comfort, a small spark of recognition in a place designed to strip them of individuality. To read words written with care was to be reminded that the outside world still contained gentleness, even from the hands of those meant to guard them. In the monotony of captivity, the poems interrupted the silence like sudden birdsong in a barren field. They could not undo the pain of war, but they could soften its edges, if only for a moment. The impact stretched beyond the personal, shaping the atmosphere within the camps. Where routines had once been defined solely by discipline and separation, the presence of poetry introduced something unexpected. It created a current of quiet resistance, a reminder that rules could be bent, that empathy could cross fences. The poems did not overturn the structure of captivity, but they carved out pockets of humanity within it. They shifted the balance of perception, altering the way captors and captives saw one another, even if only in fleeting glances. In this sense, the battlefield was transformed. It was no longer just the clash of armies, but also the conflict between silence and voice, isolation and connection. The poems were victories of a different kind, small but significant. They demonstrated that war could control bodies, but not entirely silence the human impulse to reach across divides. In their fragile existence, these exchanges showed that the battlefield extended far beyond trenches and guns, into the very hearts of those caught in the machinery of conflict. The quiet passage of poems between American soldiers and German women prisoners carried consequences that stretched far beyond the moment of exchange. At first, they might have seemed like private acts, insignificant compared to the larger events unfolding across the globe. Yet their existence revealed cracks in the rigid system of captivity. Military camps were built on control, order, and separation, but the poems disrupted that order in subtle but undeniable ways. They proved that even in spaces designed to erase individuality, human connection could emerge, refusing to be contained by fences or rules. For the women, the poems carried more than words. They offered validation that their identities were not entirely lost in the machinery of war. Being addressed as individuals, not merely as prisoners, softened the psychological weight of captivity. A line of verse, however small, reminded them that they were still seen, still remembered, as human beings. This sense of recognition had consequences for morale, giving prisoners a fragile but meaningful thread of dignity in a system that worked constantly to suppress it. The poems were not liberation, but they were resistance against invisibility. For the American soldiers, too, the consequences were deep. Writing and sharing poetry allowed them to resist the complete transformation into instruments of war. They could act outside the rigid expectations of their roles as guards, expressing emotions that uniform and command sought to bury. Each poem was an act of reclaiming individuality, a reminder that they were still capable of tenderness despite the harshness of their surroundings. In this way, the exchanges became a quiet rebellion, not against their nation or duty, but against the erosion of their own humanity. Beyond the walls of the camps, these acts reflected a wider truth about the war itself. The global conflict was fought with weapons and strategies, yet beneath it lay countless private struggles. Soldiers and prisoners alike were forced to navigate roles imposed on them, roles that reduced them to symbols of sides rather than people. The poems disrupted that reduction, offering a glimpse of what lay underneath. They showed that even amidst global hostility, the boundaries between enemy and ally were not as unbreakable as they seemed. The wider consequences were not measured in shifts of power or outcomes of battles, but in the memory of those who lived through it. For some, the poems lingered as quiet stories told long after the war had ended, reminders that compassion survived even in captivity. For others, they became unspoken memories, carried silently because they did not fit neatly into the narrative of war and victory. Yet, whether remembered aloud or in silence, the poems left their mark, shaping how individuals recalled their years of captivity. Ultimately, these consequences remind us that history is not only about generals and treaties, but also about the fragile exchanges hidden within its margins. The poems did not change the course of the war, but they changed the texture of life for those who experienced them. They created a space where humanity could breathe, however briefly, in an environment meant to suffocate it. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy of defiance against dehumanization, a reminder that even in times of the greatest division, the human need for connection could not be erased. The climax of this story did not arrive in the form of a grand confrontation or dramatic escape. Instead, it came in moments so small they could easily have been overlooked. Picture a young soldier standing by the wire at dusk, the last light of day casting long shadows across the camp. His hand tightens around a folded slip of paper, heartbeat quickening as he waits for the chance to pass it through. On the other side, a young woman waits, her eyes shifting nervously to be sure no one is watching. The exchange takes only a second, a quiet movement hidden beneath the routine of camp life, but in that second, the silence of war is broken. Each of these moments carried immense risk. Discovery could mean disciplinary action for the soldier, suspicion for the prisoner, and shame or punishment for both. Yet the exchanges continued, sustained by a need stronger than fear. The poems became fragile rebellions against the machinery of war, defying the expectation that captors and captives could never truly connect. To pass a poem was to defy not only regulation, but also the cold logic that defined enemy and ally as absolutes. It was rebellion not through violence, but through the persistence of tenderness. For the women, the moment of receiving a poem could feel both terrifying and liberating. Imagine sitting on a wooden bunk after roll call, the camp settling into silence, as she carefully unfolded a paper hidden in her sleeve. The words inside might be simple, perhaps only a few lines about memory or longing, yet they carried weight far beyond their size. To read them was to feel seen, to feel recognized as an individual rather than just a prisoner of war. The emotion could not erase her captivity, but it softened the edges, offering a brief reminder of a world beyond the fences. For the soldiers, the act of writing and delivering the poem carried its own form of climax. In those brief exchanges, they stepped outside the roles assigned to them. They were no longer just guards enforcing boundaries, but human beings reaching across them. Each verse was a declaration that they still possessed the capacity for thought, emotion, and imagination, even when uniform and regulation pressed against them. It was a moment of freedom within confinement, and it was achieved not by breaking out of the camp, but by breaking through the silence imposed by war. The climax was not one moment, but many repeated again and again in small acts of courage. A glance held too long, a scrap of paper tucked into a sleeve, a smile exchanged when no one else was watching. These gestures, fragile yet enduring, carried a power disproportionate to their size. In the history of a war defined by overwhelming violence, the climax of this story rests in these quiet exchanges that refused to be silenced, and so the highest point of this hidden history was never about victories or defeats measured on maps. It was about the resilience of connection, the refusal to let war erase the simple truth of human recognition. The climax was achieved in defiance of silence, in the courage to write and to receive, in the brief but undeniable reminder that even within captivity, the human voice could still speak. These poems, exchanged at great risk, became the moment when the boundaries of war were challenged most directly, not with weapons, but with words. In the years that followed, the poems did not become part of grand histories or military archives. They remained hidden in memory, private stories carried by those who had experienced them. For some of the women, the verses may have been folded carefully and kept, tucked into belongings, when they were finally repatriated to a devastated homeland. For others, the poems were left behind, abandoned with the barracks and barbed wire, too dangerous or too painful to preserve. Yet, whether kept or lost, they lived on as fragments in memory, reminders of a strange tenderness that existed within the harsh walls of captivity. For the soldiers, too, the memory of the poems lingered. Many returned home to families, farms, and cities that had waited for them, carrying stories they could never fully explain. The war was remembered through medals, newspapers, and official narratives of victory, but the poems did not fit easily into that frame. They were too personal, too intimate, too fragile to be shared in public. Yet, in the quiet of their own thoughts, those soldiers knew they had done something that reached beyond war. They had touched lives not with weapons, but with words, and that knowledge shaped their memories of the conflict. The legacy of these exchanges was not about romance or sentimentality, but about what they revealed of the human spirit. They showed that even in the darkest times, when ideology and conflict seemed to define every interaction, there remained an undercurrent of recognition and empathy. The poems disrupted the idea that war could completely erase compassion, reminding us that individuals still sought connection even when orders demanded separation. This legacy is subtle but powerful, a testimony that humanity survives even in places built to suppress it. Today, when we look back at the Second World War, it is easy to focus on the scale of destruction and the sweep of strategy. Yet the story of the poems reminds us to look also at the hidden moments, the ones that do not appear in history books, but live on in the memory of those who experienced them. The folded scraps of paper, passed quietly between hands, stand as evidence that war does not wholly define the people caught within it. They reveal the cracks where light entered, where voices refused to be silenced. In closing, the poems exchanged between German women prisoners and American soldiers were not mere words. They were acts of defiance against dehumanization, fragile bridges built across enemy lines. Their legacy endures, not because they changed the outcome of the war, but because they revealed something greater, the persistence of humanity in the face of division. Long after the fences were taken down and the camps were emptied, the poems remind us that even in captivity, even in enmity, the human need for connection endured. And it is in that endurance that their true historical weight lies.